but in 2020, uneventful is probably good.
That is wise words. I can totally relate.
How about you? Same thing?
Well, I've had a few dates actually, which is
Oh yeah?
out of the ordinary. Zoom
Like,
dates, woohoo!
I mean, it's something. So, any interest in a second date? Was it enough of a match that you're like, let's do this again?
Yeah, I liked her a lot, so definitely.
Awesome. That's always nice.
Yeah, she's an atheist too, which is surprising. Most of the women around here are not. Most of them around everywhere in the United States are not.
And I find the opposite problem.
Oh, really?
I mean, in the South, I mean, they're all Christian in name only. It's like, I mean, you might as well be an atheist because that's not the same. That's not what I'm looking for. So we have opposite problems, but they're the same.
Yep, yep. It's what's it? The opposite side of the same coin.
Yeah, right.
So it looks like sound is good. We got some few people in the chat checking in, saying sounds good. All right. So Matt, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure. So let's see. I grew up going to church because that's just what you do. And about 13, I got really interested in trying to understand what, when I was 13, not 2013, um, in understanding what Christianity was all about. And I tried really hard to do that through my church. And then when I was 18, I dropped out because I was looking for Christianity, but I couldn't find it there. Um, so, and then there was a variety of things that happened in between. I got really interested in some theological stuff for a while. I considered atheism very strongly for a couple of years. And so I've ended up in a really strange position. So I believe three things: God exists, Jesus rose from the dead, and American Christianity is broken.
I can
I have
agree
a
with the last one,
PhD.
100%.
I know you do. So I have a PhD in New Testament. I work in ministry, and I don't like Christianity.
Love it. Love it.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm an odd duck.
Yeah, so I'm an atheist, by which I mean I believe there are no reasons to believe in the existence of God. I've been studying philosophy and atheism for a number of years now, talking with philosophers about the topic, and just find the conversations interesting. So, could you tell me what reasons you believe there are for believing the first two things you said? I agree with you on the third
Yeah.
100%.
Perfect. Done.
Yeah, and then I'd like to tell you my thoughts on those things and hear your thoughts on my position.
Sure. Well, the three I wanted to talk about today are going to be familiar to you: the Kalam argument, the moral argument, and the resurrection argument. So maybe we start with the Kalam because, you know,
Moral resurrection.
yeah, let's start at the beginning.
All right.
It's a good place to start. So basically, it's whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. And I don't have any weird sort of variation on it. It's the basic. The universe began to exist, both scientific and philosophical arguments for it. And if things that begin to exist have a cause, then the universe also had a cause.
Right. So I would agree with all of that up to a point because I think that when they say the universe, there's an equivocation between all natural things and our universe because those are two different things. In physics, the universe just means the space, time, and matter as represented in the equations of general and special relativity. And those definitely had a beginning at the Big Bang, but it doesn't tell us anything about what's before that. So there could be something before that that's purely natural that didn't have a cause, and only the stuff in our universe had a cause, and that's the consensus in physics right now. So I would agree with the structure of the argument for sure, and if it's true, then I would grant that our universe had a beginning, but that doesn't follow that all of nature had a beginning. And so that's where I see I don't think this argument actually indicates a God. It just says that, well, our universe had a creator of some kind, but that creator could just be nature, more nature. So I don't see any reason to think this argument indicates a God.
So when you say that there could be more nature or something before the universe, are you thinking like multiverse or something else?
Sort of. That would be one of the simpler versions. The more complicated ones are like emergent spacetime from Nima Arkani Hamad. He proposes an amplituhedron, which is essentially a geometry that can exist outside of space-time, which space-time emerges from. So it's a natural thing that pre-exists before space-time. And Sean Carroll has a similar thing of emergent space-time from different kinds of quantum Hilbert space thingies. I don't understand it. And so those also can exist prior to space-time. So there's many different versions of physics that have natural things pre-existing space-time.
Well, let's say for the moment that all of that's true and that it doesn't apply. Will ever, even considering that, I think there's still the other three objections that um,
Other three
that still
objections?
hold. Like I have the other three supports for the origin of the universe. You have the second law of thermodynamics and the two philosophical arguments for the origin of the universe. Even if those,
What are the other two? Thermodynamics?
uh, the philosophical ones are the impossibility of an absolutely infinite number of things existing and the impossibility of traversing an absolutely infinite number of things.
Okay.
So even if the argument from the Big Bang doesn't carry, and I think it does, but um, before we get into the weeds on that, uh, there's still the other three arguments for the origin of the universe. So if those carry, then you still have the beginning of the universe and the Kalam still holds, even if it looks a bit different than it would with the Big Bang theory.
Oh, sure, absolutely. So I would say even all three of those are also rejected by the consensus in physics. Firstly, the second law of thermodynamics only applies to closed systems, and these theories of emergent spacetime, our universe isn't a closed system; it's an open system. Or there's a third one; it's closed, open, and then there's one that's midway point. I forget what it's called now. But so that the second law wouldn't apply to the universe in that case, and even in the cases that it does, the first law of thermodynamics, energy cannot be created or destroyed, would say that energy itself was eternal. So the energy would have existed in like a singularity or something prior to time or before time, even even if time had a beginning. So even in the case we grant the four laws of thermodynamics as being absolute, the first law says that energy cannot be created or destroyed, and that would rule out a God in the first place. It would also say energy existed eternally. So the first criteria or argument you listed, I don't think is accepted in physics. The second one is the impossibility of the infinites. That also I don't think is accepted in physics because most models in physics actually do entail a past infinite. Sean Carroll, in his debate with William Lane Craig actually brought up this argument against Sean Carroll, and Sean Carroll replied by saying, "It 30 seconds on Google and I found 37 different models that all have a past eternal infinite." So even if this argument is proposed by philosophers, it's not really accepted by physicists as being relatively strong. They don't consider it to be representative of reality in any way. It's just kind of our imaginary, how our intuitions work, but it doesn't tell us anything about how reality works. The traverse the infinite, then that's like saying that if we had started in the past infinitely and we started counting, we'd never reach to now because there'd be infinitely many points before now, and so we'd never be able to reach the now point. Well, there's ways in physics to get around that too. For example, 47. Like I just picked the number 47. There's obviously infinitely many numbers before 47, but I picked 47 just by having some kind of an iteration device in my head. And you can have the same thing in quantum mechanics, where you have a particle that could decay in infinitely many different possible times, and it picks a particular time out of those infinitely many times. Uh, but it can do that purely quantum mechanically, just like if you had something outside of time and it looked at a number graph and it said, I'm going to pick 47. It can do that to create the universe at that point in time, just like I can just pick 47. So even if there's infinitely many points before that, as long as you have something outside of time to select a specific point, you can get to the present moment, even with an infinite past. So all three of those, I think, have solutions in physics that are supported by the physics, the stuff that we have evidence for in reality, without appeal to anything outside of that, like a supernatural entity.
But talking about something picking something outside of time, now you're talking about something already existing. Whereas we were talking about the origin of the universe from not anything. And it sounds like the sort of the difference that you often get in these discussions back and forth between the physicist nothing and the philosopher's nothing, where the philosopher means not anything or the absence of anything, whereas the physicist, when they're talking about nothing, refers to something that is empty space that has some quantity of energy and is subject to laws, the physical laws like quantum mechanics and gravity. And then you're talking about something like quantum mechanics picking. When you're using picking language, I know you don't mean it this way, but it's starting to sound like you're talking about a personal agent. And I know you don't mean it that way, but it's like, what sort of naturalistic thing would you have to have that can pick something? And then you have that problem, then you have the problem with things out of nothing. It just doesn't seem to this idea sounds good, but it doesn't seem to match up with the idea of there not being anything.
Right. I don't think any physicist actually thinks there was ever not anything. There was no philosophical nothing in any model of physics. Even Sean or Lawrence Krauss, who was like the flagship pioneer of the nothing term, he's
Right.
admitted that no, he didn't mean an absolute nothing. He's never meant that. It's just his colloquial use of the word nothing. So no one
Yeah,
in
that's what
physicists.
I was getting that out of his book. What
Yeah.
A universe from nothing? That he said nothing has these properties. I'm like,
Yep.
well, I mean, you're clearly talking about something different, dude.
Yep.
So yeah,
Exactly. So no one thinks there was an absolute nothing that the universe just popped out from a literal philosophical nothing. They always think there was something before that. That's why Sean Carroll mentioned all the models he's had all have a past eternal something, even though it wasn't a past eternal this universe. So they'll admit that our universe had a beginning, but there was something before that. It was never a philosophical nothing, just a physical nothing in the fact that we can't like measure it at the time or whatever Krauss's definition is. So I
right.
don't think the nothing problem is really an issue for physicists because none of them actually use the philosophical version of nothing. I mean, even theists don't because God existed. So God existed to create something. So there's, I don't think anyone actually thinks there was literally a philosophical nothing at any point.
Nothing natural or nothing other than God is probably what the theist would say.
Right, exactly. So, and so I don't think that one's really a big concern. The second one you mentioned was, what was the second one?
Uh, well, why is that not, why is that one not a concern? Because I mean, they're talking about different things. So there's the pre-existence versus non-existence, and if we're going with the Big Bang theory, then it sounds like everything was came into being out of a philosopher's nothing, excluding any sort of God that may or may not exist. Um, Unless there was a pre-existence for something before the Big Bang. Is there supposed to be? I mean, without going into the outside, the universe, other models, on just a standard model, there wasn't supposed to be anything prior to the Big Bang, was there?
Yes, there always was. Like no one in physics actually proposed that the Big Bang was the beginning of everything. That was never hypothesis. It was only everything we currently know about. No one in science actually goes that extra step to make the metaphysical claims of absolutes. They just don't do that because it's always tentative and provisional. So even Einstein never claimed that it was absolutely everything. It was just, here is everything I can represent with these equations, and there could always be more stuff outside of that I don't know about yet. So
Well, yeah,
no,
but I mean, what they represent with equations is all of the things that we can see around us in our telescopes and describe with our physics equations. So it's everything within our universe that's observable and describable. But I mean, yeah, absolutely, their equations don't touch anything that might be outside of it. So they can say, yes, well, this is the origin of all time, space, and matter that we interact with and are inside of. But of course, there could be something out there that we can't describe. So it is out of a nothing that
we
they
know of.
say again.
Nothing that we know of. So it's all the stuff
Right,
we know about had a beginning at the Big Bang,
right.
but that doesn't mean that all natural stuff, because we don't know everything about all natural stuff. I mean, we definitely know there's certain things about natural stuff we don't know, like dark matter and dark energy and what are quarks made of, all kinds of stuff that we don't know about natural stuff. So
Well, I
it's
mean,
perfectly
yep.
reasonable to assume that the beginning of the Big Bang was just another one of those natural things we don't know about yet.
And I think the multiverse theories tell us that it is possible that something exists outside or beyond this universe. There's a lot of theories that say yes, there could be this could be a bubble universe. It could be any number of things that describe what this universe is. My One of my issues with that is that it's like, okay, these are possibilities, but do we have any reason to think that they're probabilities? Is there anything that says, do we have any evidence that says, okay, well, there probably is some other sort of universe? And I've not heard of any, but it sounds like you've read a little bit more on recent science than I have. Have you heard of something that suggests it's a probability rather than a possibility?
Sort of yes, sort of no. So the point of it would be that physics is a combination of verified principles, particles, and laws in physics. So all the different models, the multiverse, cyclic universe, the mini worlds, all of those things are just combinations of math that has already been proven to exist in our universe. So the multiverse is a combination of vacuum states and early universe inflation from Guth. And so those two things have been demonstrated to exist, even though we haven't demonstrated the multiverse. And so if you take the math from those two things and combine it together, you get the multiverse as a consequence. So the difference between this and the theistic approach is that they're only using things that we've empirically verified to exist to build their models, whereas theism is adding things we don't have empirical evidence for, like all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving, whatever particular properties of God you may want to attribute. And so we have more evidence in that way for the physics combinations than we do for the supernatural explanations. Kind of like if we saw a hoof print in the snow, we said, oh, it's probably a horse. That would have more evidence because of all the background knowledge than if we said, oh, it's a unicorn, because we have no background knowledge of a unicorn. And
Sure.
in that sense, the physics has more evidence for its explanations of what caused the Big Bang than the theistic explanations.
So you said that the math describes the early inflationary period of the universe and things in the same way that it describes the existence of something like a multiverse.
Uh,
It predicts that this is
backwards.
a possibility thing.
Backwards.
They're both
So
together. Yeah.
the math that describes the early universe of inflation, the board's early universe inflation, that math was taken along with the math from vacuum states and energy. That math was taken. They add the two together. So they have these, it's like take two particles, gold and rubidium, and you add them together, then what do you get, kind of a thing? And you hypothesize about what you're going to get. So they're taking the mathematical equations that have been empirically proven to exist, combining them in different ways and saying, well, what does this result in? And so these are things we already know exist, and then we're going to combine them and see if they can explain the origin of the universe or whatever.
So if that's where we get the idea for something that might be outside of the universe, then would our math still describe whatever might be outside of our universe?
Uh, yes. So it's like the possible explanations are the things we're describing are purely in the universe, a result of something we don't know about, or they could be a result of something prior to the universe that caused the universe. And we don't know which is the case. And so we make different hypotheses. Maybe it's just stuff in the universe. Maybe it's stuff connected to whatever's prior to the universe. And then we try to make predictions or explanations about which one we should prefer. And so the multiverse explanation is saying that these things are connected to what was prior to the universe. And we can show that in the math that that is a reasonable conclusion based on the physics. I don't really understand quantum mechanics that well, but so it does. Go ahead.
I was trying to remember. I can't remember. Was it Schrodinger or was it Niels Bohr? It might have been Bohr who had said that anyone who claims that he understands quantum mechanics doesn't.
Richard Feynman also.
Feynman, my mistake. I couldn't remember who it was attributed to. I just remember the quote, and I was like, "That's so appropriate."
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. But if the math describes, at least to some degree, what goes on outside of the universe, would the physical laws that apply to this universe not apply to whatever might be outside of it?
Depends. Like the physical laws described in those math would, because that's kind of the extrapolation, is that these things, if we understand them correctly, the physical laws that apply to them also apply to prior to the universe. So they're connected to whatever was prior to the universe. And that's the theory of the amplituhedron and emergent spacetime, is that we're trying to see these laws we think don't just apply to the universe, they also apply to whatever was before the universe.
So if those laws apply to this universe and whatever is before it, then wouldn't we still have the same sorts of things like the first and second laws of thermodynamics applying to whatever came before or caused this universe? If the math applies in both places and the physics is based on the math, then shouldn't it still apply there as well as here?
Mostly yes, but some parts no. So only the parts that are entailed in the equations would be also a part of before the universe. So that's how we say it's before spacetime, because they removed the spacetime from the equation. So there's no spacetime in the equations for the multiverse. You could just get rid of it. And that's what leaves you with or not the multiverse, the amplituhedron. There's no space-time in the math for the amplituhedron, so it's not a part, it's not applied to the thing that Nima Arkani Hamad is arguing for. And so what you do is you take the math and you try to remove like the things that you think are contingent, like space-time, and say, well, what can exist prior to that without the space-time? This is what we're left with. And so some of them apply. We're saying that these specific things can apply without other things, like we get rid of space-time. So the first, second, third, fourth law of thermodynamics, none of that's actually a problem for before or after the Big Bang. Like it could apply before, it may not. It's not really a part of the theories. It doesn't make a difference one way or the other because it doesn't cause a problem. Because of the first law, energy can't be created or destroyed. And so if energy exists in the form of an amplituhedron as opposed to space-time, it would just be the same kind of a conclusion. There's not really a difference there. So again, the first four laws, the second law specifically only applies to closed systems. So, and again, it doesn't invalidate the first law. So even if we just applied the first four laws, none of those would actually be a contradiction to anything in the physics just being past eternal.
I'd really love to respond with something intelligent, but I don't know what an amplituhedron is. That's a new thing to me, so I'd have to look that up and spend some more time studying it. So I'm just going to pass on a response for that one. Sorry.
That's okay. Perfectly reasonable. I do, because I remember you brought up 2 points there before, but I can't remember what the second one was.
That was a while ago. I don't remember.
All right. Well, so would that be a sufficient justification for a naturalist to say there's probably a natural explanation, or could be a natural explanation to the origin of the universe, and we don't? And it's not.
I can't answer that based on the theory that you brought up. The problem is that it sounds like that again, and I can't fully respond because I don't know how to respond to the theory you brought up. But the theory, if the math applies in both directions, it would sound like the physics applies. And I'm not understanding how you're saying it's not a closed system, because if it includes all things that exist, then that is, at least from a naturalist perspective, it's a closed system because there's nothing outside of it. So I don't know how that still wouldn't apply. But again, you mentioned something about there being a possibility of an open system on a naturalistic perspective, and I'm having a hard time imagining what that would even be like. Open to what? Like, what would be outside of the set of all things?
Well,
It all natural things.
Well, it wouldn't be a set of all things. It would just be a set of the things that thermodynamics applies to and the things that it doesn't apply to. So the second law of thermodynamics doesn't get rid of the energy. Energy isn't destroyed by the second law of thermodynamics ever. So energy is always there. And so if you have a certain kind of an energy state that produces more energy, like quantum states in vacuum energy, then that would override the second law of thermodynamics. It will produce a high or low entropy. I think it's low entropy. I think it's backwards. It will produce a low entropy state like at the universe, and then which will then decay. But so the first law would say it's perfectly fine to have low energy states pop into existence from quantum fluctuations because they exist prior to the second law.
So is this something that occurs differently than occurs in our universe? Because thermodynamics only works one way in our universe.
No, we've disproven that with vacuum states. We've shown that in the vacuum of space, particles can pop in and out of existence on their own.
Yes.
And that is just applied. Well, in some cases, it's more particles that pop in. In some cases, it's less particles that pop in. And there's a probability distribution of the amount of particles that are going to pop in at any given time. And given enough space and enough time, you get an entire universe that would pop into existence because it can have more particles, like 10 particles that pop into existence at one time, or 20 or 40. It just takes more time to get a higher number to eventually just pop into existence. And so eventually, if you have enough time and enough space, there will be just a universe of particles that pops into existence from the quantum mechanics. So they're taking the exact same stuff we see in our universe and applying it to a larger scale.
Yeah, but the problem is, if you're assuming that the universe popped into existence out of a quantum vacuum or something like that, into a low entropy state, it's the fact that we see an enormous universe like we do now, that you run into the Boltzmann brain problem, because it's infinitely more likely, well, not infinitely, but really more likely that we're going to see a much smaller universe than we do, maybe something the size of our solar system, or a single brain that's popped into existence and is just imagining all of this. But if we have that particular case where it's a single brain that's popped into existence and we're just imagining this, then we're basically thinking that we live in the Matrix and the external world isn't real and we're just imaginations. So not only would we have to believe that something that size could do that, but that it did it far beyond the most likely scenario, which would be something much, much smaller.
Right. There's a number of replies to the Boltzmann brain in physics. Like, most physicists don't think it's a serious reply because you'd have to have a universe pop into existence with all of the laws that can maintain a brain enough to have consistent thoughts or whatever, and think you're seeing something about the external world, and have it build an entire model of the world in your brain but not actually have the world there, which is actually more complicated than just building the universe or a system that we see as simple as the universe based on a certain set of laws and have it produce brains. So the argument against the Boltzmann brain, why it's not accepted by the consensus of physicists, is that it's actually more complicated and the probability of that happening is actually lower than the probability of just creating a universe.
Seems like it wouldn't be, because all you would need to have a brain is um, a world that would support life, such as Earth in a solar system or something like that. And then once it's able to imagine things on its own, like life evolved here, and then you have thinking rational being, rationalish beings like us, capable of thought. Like the rest of the universe is rather unnecessary. So all you would need is the smaller version rather than the whole thing.
Yeah,
So
but to create the smaller version, you have to have the same physics of the whole thing in addition to more physics. So the physics that governs the entire universe is a simple set of a few dozen laws. But if you want to have just a small part of the universe, you'd have to have those few dozen laws apply to this small area in addition to a whole bunch of other laws that made it function in the way we see it now, as opposed to when the universe is just those same laws just going on for a longer period of time. So it would actually be more complicated to try and pop into existence just the small chunk of the universe that is 13.8 billion years in motion than just to have a big universe just go for that long and produce something.
I don't see why you need the additional laws, but okay, I understand why you need a universe, why it is not overly difficult, for why it's simpler or requires less moving parts for a universe to just begin and run its natural course. But it's still a whole lot more coming out of the quantum vacuum than a much smaller thing. I don't know how to run the probabilities on that, but it seems more complicated to have a much larger amount of matter come out of the quantum vacuum into a low entropy state than it would to have a smaller amount. But
Oh yeah, I totally agree. Just purely based on the amount, you're totally right. A smaller amount would be simpler than a larger amount. But in order to form a brain, you need that smaller amount to be in a specific configuration. Like if I just threw a bunch of dice, like threw 10 dice versus 100 dice, obviously the 10 dice probability is going to be a lot higher than the 100 dice probability. It's going to be harder to get the 100 dice to repeat than the 10 dice to repeat. But if I need it to be an exact formulation to fit a brain, and then that's going to be a lot harder than just random dice rolling. So if we have a random dice rolling big universe pop into existence that eventually produces brains, that would be more likely than just having a small amount of particles pop in the exact configuration of a brain. That would be far more difficult, specifically because to have a brain, you also need those other laws to keep it in shape, to have thoughts in the first place. So you need all of the prior laws for the big universe, just with less matter, and then have a brain exactly in configuration pop into existence. Whereas with just the big universe, you have all the particles pop into existence and they just happen to form into a brain through random interactions.
I'll have to think about that some more, but it still doesn't seem quite right. The
Yeah,
problem is running the probabilities on that. I don't know how to do that.
that's
So,
that's fair. I just reference the academic journals on those because the consensus is that's not really a big issue.
okay.
So, and then, so from your perspective, does my argumentation sound at least plausible as far as you can tell?
The problem is the one thing that I can't interact with, but the other is there are still, I still think the Big Bang Theory applies, and the other ones do as well. I still think the second law and the two philosophical arguments apply. So it sounds like the universe began to exist, and even if you try to go to something beyond that, like a multiverse, you're still just going to run into the same sorts of problems that you do with this universe, whether it's a expanding multiverse, whether it's a cyclic multiverse, or what have you. It's just the same problem backed up one step. So nothing has really changed. And unless we have reason to think that it's actually probable that something like that exists and not just possible, then it's still just really neat guesswork. We just need something to suggest that it's probable more than possible.
Okay, so if vacuum states disproved that the second law of thermodynamics applied to everything, would that lower your confidence in that argument? Like if physicists in general accepted that the vacuum states can produce particles, which goes against the second law of thermodynamics, and there's no contradiction there. Would that be
But
sufficient to convince you that the second law argument doesn't really work?
but were there vacuum states prior to this universe or not? Like that's another question too. Like even if they can produce a universe, does that necessarily mean that they did? Did that they existed, or was it something out of a philosopher's nothing?
Right, that would be the second
So
question. So just the first question is if the consensus in physics is that vacuum states can overturn the second law of thermodynamics under these specific circumstances, would that lower your confidence in the second law argument that you're presenting?
I think that's one piece of the puzzle, but there's a lot more pieces to the puzzle than just can they produce something like a low entropy state. There's also the question of their existence prior to this universe that we're in. There's the question of can they produce something like this universe, or is it going to be something that's much smaller because uh, the probabilities are very unlikely, and then because the probabilities are unlikely, how long of time would you need prior to this? And you're talking about a nearly infinite period of time. And if you had an infinite period of time, then absolutely, because anything happens with an infinite period of time. But then you'd still have to prove that there was an infinite period of time, and that if there was, then you could get from there to here. And so it's more complicated than just saying, well, yes, if vacuum states could produce this, then we're there. Well, there's like five more pieces right there, and
Oh, absolutely, I
there's
totally
more
agree.
beyond that. So,
Oh, absolutely, I totally agree.
I mean, yeah, it's like saying, well, if you could disprove, uh, one piece out of like the 100 piece puzzle, I mean, sure, but there's another 99 left, so there's a lot more pieces, and it's not just that one thing.
Sure. So, but my argument would be is if we can do this with things we already know that exist, then that seems to be more reasonable to believe than something that we don't know exists caused it. So, for example, the horse, if we saw a footprint in the snow, it's reasonable to include a horse rather than a unicorn. The same thing seems to apply when we're talking about what caused the Big Bang. If it can be explained by vacuum states and early universe inflation, we should probably prefer that explanation because we know those things exist to a god or to something supernatural that we don't have any evidence for existing. Wouldn't that make sense?
Well, I'm not actually referring to a god at this moment. I'm just referring to the origin of the universe or not. Um, Whether there's a God gets into the question of, okay, based on what we can know about the origin of the universe, what is the most likely explanation of this sort of a cause? So we can't actually get to the deity part until we understand the nature of the cause, which is, why Craig goes the direction that he does and say, timeless space and so forth. Um, but it's being able to see a few particles come out of the quantum vacuum from energy into matter is it's it's like it's a much larger version of seeing a footprint and saying, okay, there's a horse, to saying, um, oh, there's a footprint and there's a horse. Now let me infer that there's this group of people who ride them and train them and so forth. And suppose you were living in a time before that was actually a thing, who ride horses and shoot on horseback and do all this sort of stuff. It's like it's taking it further than just simply saying, oh, well, it can be done in this small instance. It's like, yeah, but you're going past that from a few particles to the entirety of everything that we can see.
Would that be different from Einstein or Newton seeing something falling and then concluding, oh, there's a black hole, this like super form of gravity or whatever? Isn't that the same kind of reasoning where you just see a smaller event that can be applied in lots of different cases and just say, well, what if this happened a whole bunch at the same time kind of a thing?
Well, I think they probably took the idea of seeing this first initial thing and then like, all right, well, let's try to figure this out. Let's see how the math works and see if I can extrapolate this and other things, and did other tests. It's not that just, oh, we had this one piece of information and then, from there developed everything.
What do you mean? Like, because from my perspective, I think we see this phenomenon and we can say, if this pattern applies to a larger scale, here's what we can see. And it's the same thing that Newton and Einstein did when we said, well, here's this pattern of gravity. What happens if we imagine it to the highest extent it can be? And then we get things like black holes or stars or whatever. So it seems like we're doing the same reasoning there. I don't see a difference.
Well, the big difference is with relativity is when you're trying to test that, then you go out and you find there's evidence that backs up relativity, and then we've actually seen black holes and a picture of one recently, and so on and so forth. Um,
Well, sure, but if you
it,
imagine back when Einstein's time, when he didn't have any evidence for them, because I don't think he had any evidence of black holes till much later in his life.
no, but there was evidence to demonstrate relativity. But I think that was, I don't know if that was after him or if it was
Oh yeah,
um,
Einstein did the test where he measured the curvature of light around the sun
right.
personally, so he definitely had evidence of relativity, just like we have evidence of vacuum state particles. So I think that would be the point of my analogy is that we have evidence of those things existing. And then if we take those to their extreme, then we get the conclusion of the early universe inflation or the universe popping into existence from these vacuum states kind of a thing, just like we get the conclusion of a black hole following Einstein's inferences from the small things that we showed that confirmed his hypothesis. We then extrapolated from those to make these big things that he couldn't confirm yet. It seems like we're doing the same thing with the vacuum states. We have these small instances of just seeing vacuum states and we can prove those exist. And then we extrapolate from those the larger consequences like the multiverse thing, even though we can't show those yet, just like Einstein couldn't for the black hole.
But the difference is trying to bring something out of a vacuum state within our universe is different than trying to bring our universe out of something which may or not have even had a vacuum state to begin with. Because if it was the philosopher's nothing, then there wasn't a vacuum state. And so if there wasn't a vacuum state, then there's nothing for any laws to work on. There was no anything. So it's not exactly the same question. If there were a vacuum state to begin with, then it'd be a little bit easier, but there's still a large difference. So there's two questions there. Was there a vacuum state to begin with prior to the universe or not? And if so, how much time and what are the probabilities of the difference between a couple particles and the relatively simpler version of the entire universe coming out of that state?
Would that be different from saying, well, Einstein could be wrong, so we shouldn't conclude black holes? Isn't the fact that we do have evidence of that, of general relativity being true, sufficient to justify the conclusion there are black holes prior to us discovering the black holes?
Well, Einstein's saying that general relativity is true, and then going on to posit black holes is still functioning within this universe and according to our physical laws. Doing so, it's just taking what we already know and extrapolating those laws to their logical conclusion. We're talking about a time when laws might not have existed yet because there might not have been anything. Now, if it is, Krauss's and others' idea of the physicist nothing, when there was a quantum, if and there might have been empty physical space with positive energy and physical laws applying to it prior to this universe, then it might be a little bit easier. If there's not, and you're talking about a philosopher's nothing, then none of that applies. So we're still back to that.
Well, because I still see that to be the same as the analogy with general relativity. It's possible that he's taking the physics he has evidence for and applying it to other things really far away that we can't see yet. And so he doesn't know if the laws that he's describing apply to those new things that he can't see yet. He's just inferring that based on his best guess. And it seems like we're doing the same thing with the vacuum states, where we have these vacuum states now in our universe, and we're assuming that those apply prior to the universe. We can't prove it yet. We don't know that, just like Einstein couldn't for the black holes. We're taking the things we do know and applying them to an area we don't know to explain something. But that seems to be perfectly reasonable to do based on inductions. We have evidence of this thing. Let's see, maybe it caused that other thing too. I don't see a difference there, even though you mentioned that it's outside of the universe. I definitely agree that's a difference between general relativity and early or emergent space-time. But that's just a different area we didn't know about. So Einstein just didn't know about the black holes far away, and we just don't know about prior to the universe. But it still seems reasonable to be able to infer outside of that from the things we do know.
If two points on this. First is if the quantum states apply prior to the universe, then you have a point on it could potentially produce a universe. If not, then, and if it's just the philosopher's nothing, then we're nowhere and it's still the universe coming out of not anything. But if there is a quantum state in which prior to the universe, in which the universe could come into existence, and then now we're into the question about traversing an absolutely infinite number of things, because why is it that we don't see an infinitely old universe? We see one that looks like it's finite in age, about 13.7 something billion years old. Why is it we don't see an infinitely old universe? And what would have caused the state to not have produced it already at some infinitely far back period of time in the past, or um, just, for lack of a better word, decide to create it when it did.
Um, well, it seems like quantum fluctuations can, like a random number generator, can just pick something at random. Like if you have a particle that's going to decay, it can decay at any infinite span of time, and it just picks one essentially at random. But it seems like quantum mechanics can just pick something, not like deliberately conscious choice kind of a thing, but they just, like a random number generator, just generate a
Sure.
number. But it seems like that same thing could apply to the creation of the universe. If these quantum laws did exist prior to space-time, they could, as an iteration device, create the universe at this point in time rather than this one, in the same way that a particle decays at this point in time rather than that one. So that doesn't seem to be too much of a challenge to quantum mechanics, since we already have a mechanism that can do that.
Yeah, I'm not really arguing about the mechanism for that. I'm more concerned about the timing, because let's say you have your random number generator for deciding when this particular universe is going to be created. If you have an infinite period of time prior to now, then why wasn't the universe created already ago? And why are we not looking at a universe that's already infinitely old, which it doesn't look like? So we should have already gotten there. Otherwise, yeah, I'm basically asking, why are we looking at a non infinitely old universe? Because it should have already happened.
Well, many, like the multiverse theory says it did, probably, like this the same universe that's happened multiple times. So that wouldn't be an issue, I don't think. And the idea is like, why would the particle decay at this time and not any of the infinitely prior times? Uh, just because it's how it randomly generates numbers. Essentially, it's just a product of the laws. So I don't see that as an issue, really. It's just kind of like saying, well, why did I pick 47 and not 32? Like, well, it's how my brain just picked the number randomly, essentially. So I don't see that as an issue. Like, why? It's like asking, why did I pick 47 and not, why didn't we see that number or a different number picked earlier? I mean, I don't see that as an issue when asking, like, why did I pick a particular number? Why would that be different for a quantum particle picking a particular time rather than any time before that?
No, it's not about the particular time. It's about getting from infinity past to where we are now. I mean,
Well, let me see if I can clarify. So let's say
okay,
there's negative infinitely many numbers and positively infinitely many numbers, and I'm going to pick a number at random, 47. Now, how did I get to that number? And then I'm going to start counting. So 47, 48, 49, 50. I'm just going to start counting from there. Like, so obviously I'm at some number at the present, like 52 or whatever, and just keep counting. But how did I get there, even though there were infinitely many numbers in the past? Well, I just started at one particular number in the middle. I didn't start infinitely many in the past. I started like at 47 and then started counting upwards. So the quantum particle essentially does the same thing. It just picks 13.8 million years ago and starts counting there to create the universe. So it seems like it has no problem skipping the past infinite, because it can use the same kind of iteration device as quantum particles decaying to just pick a number to start from 13.8 billion years ago.
it can't pick if it doesn't already exist. So either something just begins to exist, or things have always been there. And if you're talking about a multiverse in which every single iteration has happened many, many, many times, and we're just one more of those, then you're basically talking about a multiverse that has existed from infinity past. And if it's existed from infinity past and we're just one more of anything, then there's nothing special about this, and it just, that's just the way things are. But if you're talking about quantum particle picking a time, then it's either going to be coming out of infinity past, or it's going to be something that begins to exist at some period of time. So which way are you going with that? Is it that
Uh,
whatever began everything off has just always been around and it's infinitely old, or whatever began everything off began to exist?
Infinitely old. So I'm going for, there's going to be a natural thing that has always existed. There's a natural necessary thing, essentially, is my argument.
Okay. Is that natural necessary thing? Are you talking it's a multiverse and we're just, it just produces universe after universe and after universe, and we're one of infinitely many of the exact same that get produced because there's an infinity of universes? Or are you going a different direction with it?
Yeah, that's definitely one of the possibilities. Like it could be that it just produces different universes one after another, and each universe is perfectly unique and different from every other one. So there's different ways it could work. I don't really have a. We haven't solved what is the foundation of reality yet, but there's many possibilities. One is that we're just a copy of many other copies, but we'd still be unique because Leibniz's law of identity, since we exist now and not whenever those things existed, we're clearly different from those other universes, even though we share every other property. So we'd still be unique in that sense. But yeah, I would go one of those two directions. Either we're just a bunch of infinitely many universes that are just copies, or we're just one in a series of sequential universes, and this is just the one we're a part of.
Do you have a preference, or is it just sort of a
No, it
wait and
doesn't.
see sort of thing?
Yeah, just kind of a wait and see. I don't really. It doesn't make a difference to my worldview either way.
It seems like a lot of. It seems like you're positing a whole lot of universes, a lot of causes beyond necessity, without actually saying that okay, there's evidence for this particular thing, that this is why it is. It seems a lot simpler to say that well, there's this one and we have evidence for this one, but until we actually have evidence for all of these other infinite number, that there's no reason to suggest that those are what actually exist.
I'm not sure what you mean. So, for example, uh, like we could posit that just the universe is the only thing that exists, and there's nothing prior to it.
Mhm.
That's a possibility. It's also possible to do that in a natural hypothesis as well. Just say our universe is the necessary thing, and it just created our created the universe as we see it 13.8 billion years ago, and there's just nothing else before or after, essentially, except just whatever the energy law is that existed to create the universe. That's a possibility, but I don't see that as any more parsimonious than saying there was a infinite set of universes prior to that, because it's still just the same kind of a law. Um, why would that be simpler, or why would that be like the positing things without necessity? Why would that be the case?
The suggesting that there's an infinite number of universes in order to address the question of why it really seems like that's being suggested in order to address the question of why did this universe seem to begin to exist when it did and deal
Let
with
me
the
see. I don't think that's the case. Like the reason we posit there's an infinite amount is because we don't see any stopping for vacuum states. Like vacuum states just seem to go indefinitely, which is why we think there's infinitely many universes. Because if vacuum states go indefinitely and they can create a universe, well, then obviously they're going to create infinitely many universes. Just like if you have a rock that can fall eternally, obviously it's just going to keep falling. But I don't think it's meant to solve why we're here. It's just a consequence of the combination of physics that we're using. Vacuum states just happen to go indefinitely, and that's why we lead to an infinite universe. I mean, we can definitely limit it and say it's just one or two or 10 if you want. I just think that'd just be less parsimonious in the math sense.
well, it seems like the options that we're coming down to are either there's an infinite number of universes that are just being created on and on and on and on and on, or there's we've got this one which may or may not have anything outside of that we've yet to see. And so I think the question is going to come down to what evidence do we actually have that any of these other universes actually exist or not? Because if it's just this one and there's nothing outside of it, I think the evidence does point to the origin of this universe, and then the Kalam would carry. The question that we'd have to answer, and the thing that would uh, invalidate the Kalam argument, would be is if we can actually provide evidence for something that exists outside of this universe. So um, I think that's the real question. I've not. So yeah, that.
Oh yeah, I can totally understand that. Would you consider the consensus of experts in physics and cosmology to be good evidence that there's probably something prior to it?
Consensus of opinion or consensus of
Evidence. That's
yeah, I'd like to see the evidence more than I'm interested. Like I value the opinion of experts a whole lot. The I would like to see the evidence why they think this. So is it an opinion based on this is just our best guess, or is it a this is the evidence that we've actually seen? Here's why 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
yeah.
I'd
As
like
far
to see the
as
second one.
Definitely, as far as I know, the consensus is that space time itself is emergent in all of the different evidences we have of that, like vacuum states and early universe inflation, when we combine all the different versions of math, we usually get that as the results, which seems to be the consensus in physics based on all the different combinations of evidence that we have that space-time is emergent. And so there was a natural thing prior to it.
I'll have to take a look at that. Everything I've read at this point says it's certainly possible based on all the math, but not that there's actually any evidence to say that this is what we've actually seen. It has happened. Here you go. Our universe is different now because this other one has existed. That sort of thing.
And you don't consider just combinations of things that we have verified a form of evidence?
It depends on what it is. I'd have to look at it, and I'd have to yeah, I'd have to look at it and see what it says.
Okay, fair enough. All right, so I want to move to the second one. You said the moral argument.
Mm-hmm. Yes. If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. Objective moral values do exist, therefore God exists.
All right, I'm a moral realist, so I believe there is objective morality without a God. Like most philosophers, I think 57% of philosophers are moral realists, even though like 72 are atheists or something. So
Okay.
I think there's lots of different versions of moral realism that can exist without a God. Why do you believe it can only exist with a God?
The problem that I have is coming up with a foundation for moral values without a God. So where do you come up with your foundations for objective moral values without a God? What's your foundation for them?
Well, there's lots of ways. My personal one is it's a higher order emergent property, but just to give a simple example, like it could just be a platonic form. Let's use Plato's example. That way, they could exist without a God. There's lots of different ways they could. I don't see why, in your argument, that you seem to imply that God is the only way that they could, or even that God does. I don't see how God even does produce a foundation for moral values.
On theism or on theism or especially Christianity, the way I see God producing it has to do with how we were made. Um, because I see objective moral values as something related to how the human machine functions. Um, Such as sort of like how gasoline powered engines require oil in order to be able to function correctly, that there are certain things that you have to do to those machines in order to get them to work the way they're supposed to, or the human machine in a different context. Say you go to the gym and you have a trainer who's teaching you how to do a deadlift. You're going to be told don't round your back because it's going to put a whole bunch of extra pressure on a particular spot, and it's going to increase your likelihood of injury. The same sort of thing, that this is how humans are designed to function, and there's certain ways that we were made to function well, and certain ways we're not. So on Christian theism, that's what I see moral values as being, ways that humans are meant to function well and other ways they're not.
Well, my first question would, how would that apply to moral values? Like, I just think G.E. Moore's open question argument and the is-ought problem seem to defeat that. Like, that would be an is, so it is the case that there is a God, and it is the case that he designed us in this way, but how does that get us to an ought, that we should be moral in those cases?
The ought is that partly that if you want to function correctly, then these are the ways that you should act. Also, we were created in order to be able to both reflect and represent God. And so if we're going to be able to fulfill our purpose as humans well, we need to be able to function, or we need to function in that particular way. So that is something that we should do. So it partly comes out of the fact that we were made for this by being who intended us to do this, and also because this is our purpose for which we're supposed to actually do these things.
So that still seems to be more like is. So if God created us to represent him for his purpose, that would still be an is statement. I don't think that would get us to an ought. And the first one you mentioned, like if we want to function correctly, we should therefore do these things. I think that would be fit into Kant's hypothetical imperative, not a, like the objective would be like a categorical imperative, something you're supposed to do independent of what you want. But if we're doing it because we want it, that would be hypothetical. Like if I want to gain weight, I should eat chocolate ice cream or something. That doesn't make it objectively true. So I don't see either of those as actually solving the is-ought problem. And I think the reason most philosophers don't accept God as a solution is because it seems to face the same problems as any other model of objective morality, that it can't actually solve these. I don't think there's any accepted solution to these big problems of objective morality.
And why is it that the God problem doesn't solve the objective morality question, but a naturalistic emergence property does?
My solution is to get rid of the oughts entirely. I think morality is descriptive. That's how I solve it. But the consensus in moral philosophy is no, there is no solved objective morality. It's all just a bunch of different hypotheses, kind of like physics, where like what created the universe? We have no idea. We're going to have a bunch of different hypotheses and make predictions and hope one's right. Same kind of thing with morality. It's an unsolved problem in philosophy. So, but most people don't accept the God argument because it fails for the same reasons as everything other than the God argument, but a lot of other reasons in addition to that, which is why it's one of the minority views. So I don't think that saying that God exists and created us for a purpose and he has some moral nature or whatever, all those would be is statements, but none of those would get us to an ought, because as essentially a conscientious objector or whatever, I could say, okay, it's nice that God exists. It's nice that he created us. It's nice that he is the moral absolute or whatever, but why should I care? Why should I do what he says? And it seems like you can always have an infinite regress of asking that question. For any answer you can give, I can say, well, that's nice, but why should I care? Why should I have an ought there? And it doesn't seem like there's any way that you can solve that problem. It's one of the foundational problems in philosophy, the Agrippa's trilemma.
Yeah, but if you follow Agrippa's trilemma to its logical conclusion, then you can't know anything, and you just ended up with sort of a radical skepticism, because you can't. Well, we as humans anyway are limited in our ability to answer the why questions. It's like, and so if you're saying that, well, I can't answer if I can't provide an answer for the why, or for the why of the why, or the why of the why of the why, then I don't know anything. So basically, we're saying we're at the mercy of a 2-year-old who asks the why question forever, and we can't answer it. Like, anybody who's tried to do that knows it's like, well, you do have an answer to at least the first few, probably, and depending on your knowledge level, you can go a bit farther. But it's not that there isn't necessarily an answer. It's just that maybe I'm not capable enough of providing it. So even if I'm not capable of providing it, that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Of course, then you run into the epistemological problem of like, well, what does it actually mean to know something, and so forth. And so there's the philosopher's question, where how do you know where you know something? But then there's practical questions like, yeah, I know there is an answer to this, and I know what it is. I just don't know how to describe the fact that I know it. And so there's sort of two levels of knowing something that actually is true, and being able to describe how you know that it's true.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. But I would see there's a further problem with the is-ought dilemma it provides is kind of like the square root of a pork chop. Like, if you're saying I can square root a pork chop, wait a minute, those are two different categories of things. How do you square root a pork chop? It doesn't make any sense. That kind of seems to be the same question the is-ought question is asking. Like, how do you get from these is statements to that ought statement? Is like, how do you square root that pork chop? And so it seems like just saying God has all these properties and created us for these reasons, is moral, whatever, doesn't seem to get us to that ought any more than the square root can get us to the pork chop.
I think the is-ought problem is a bigger issue for naturalism, though, than it is for theism, because, I mean, there's a number of different ways that you could suggest that maybe God has done these things, and various people have tried defending one or the other. I spend more of my time on trying to figure out what he's actually told us that we're supposed to do, rather than why we're supposed to follow it. But if there's a personal agent there, then you have options. If there's not, for crossing the is-ought barrier, if there's not a personal agent there, you seem to be rather limited. And so, even though we both agree that there are moral, objective morals in this world, and we probably agree on a number of what those are, the question is, how do we get to those in a way that's consistent? And so, so we might agree on, a lot of people that I would disagree with on how we get to those, and or some people would say that objective moral values don't exist. I'd say, well, okay, you're living better than your worldview allows for, and we agree on this particular thing that we're talking about. But what is the actual foundation for those? And it seems easier with a personal agent than it does if you have nothing but just nature, because it's just, okay, these are just the way things are.
What do you mean? Because when I'm like reading the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, both for the is-ought problem and G.E. Moore's open question argument, it specifically says this applies both to natural and supernatural causes equally.
Okay. But how do you, I understand you're saying that it does apply to both, but they're they're not equal situations because one is without an agent who can and I don't know whether I want to defend divine command theory or not, but you have a being which has the ability to do things like that, if that's how it works or not. Um, with naturalism, you don't have anything like that. There's no options. So I
Uh,
don't understand how you get to an ought on naturalism.
well, how would a god having some particular nature and giving some particular commands be different than, for example, morality being a law of nature? Why would that be? Why would one be more or less
It could be a
applicable?
law of nature in which God created a law saying this is how things work. But how would a law of nature be created by nature? How would nature create a moral law saying that we ought to act in these ways and not others?
Or it would just be a foundational law of the necessary part of nature, kind of like gravity or whatever. It's just one of the things ingrained in its nature, kind of like how you see morality is ingrained in God's nature. So morality wasn't, God didn't like create morality in himself. He was already there, kind of a thing. Same thing with would apply to nature. But it seems like I don't see how a God would be, it would be a different situation for the two cases, naturalism and a God. It seems like the is-ought problem and G.E. Moore's open question would apply equally to both. They could both assert to have some kind of a nature that grounds morality, one in God's nature or one in nature's nature, and to try to solve that problem. So I don't see why that would be the case that theism would have an advantage in those instances.
Well, if human beings were created to reflect and represent God, which is what the whole image of God thing is all about, um, then the law that would be created there was you are to reflect God well in the world that you live in. And so that would be the law that would be created. But nature, there's there's nothing like that. There's no you're supposed to act this particular way. And many of the ways that we see people acting today, that we say, okay, this is objectively right or objectively wrong, you can find parallels in nature when it's just like, well, this is just how nature functions, and it doesn't seem like we've come up with an answer to be able to say why we do or don't act in this particular way, and when nature does the opposite.
Well, do you need a purpose like that for morality? Because I don't think that's a requirement.
What do you mean? Do you need a purpose for morality? Like for
Well, like you said, in order to have morality, God created us for this specific purpose. Therefore, God has an advantage. God-based morality has an advantage because we have this specific purpose. Whereas I see morality as more just a law like gravity, it just applies to the universe. It's not that we have a purpose that we're trying to adhere to. It's just these actions are immoral actions, these actions are moral actions, kind of a thing. Like these actions are towards gravity, these actions are away from gravity. They're, so I don't think you need to have a being who created you for a purpose to have morality. I think morality can exist without the idea of teleology in that sense.
you, if by morality means simply a description of how human beings act, then that's one thing. But if by morality you mean how human beings should act, then there's another. Because it's sort of like the question of whether we have free will. And let's just stick with Newton right now, because quantum mechanics adds a whole other layer of complexity into it. If on Newton's theory of the universe, everything is sort of determined, then we don't really have free will. If there's no soul, there's no God or anything outside of that. If we're just particles moving around, then it's impossible to have free will. You need something that's sort of outside of that chain of events, whether it's a God or a quantum mechanics or something like that, that's not subject to just the this billiard ball hits that billiard ball and it hits the next one, um, and then you don't really have any freedom. It's just this is just a description of the way things are. Morality, I think, is a bit like that. In order to be able to have a should, you need something that's sort of outside that chain of dependent events, one thing going from one to another to another to another. And so, as long as there's just the nature describing this is the way things are, then it seems like we're rather sort of inside that dependent chain of events. And it's slightly different. It's meant to be as an analogy, but as long as it's just a description of the way things are, then there's nothing that can allow us to get to a should or an ought. But if you have something that's outside of that, then it seems like you would have the ability to have more of a should or an ought.
I don't quite see the difference there. For like, let's go with your example of free will. Like, it should be equally as possible to have free will in a naturalistic universe as just some undiscovered property of nature that we don't know about yet, as it would be in a supernatural universe. I don't see how, if free will is made of some kind of a supernatural property,
No,
that
no,
it would
no.
be
I'm not trying to get in the free will
right,
discussion.
right,
That's
right.
I
I'm
no,
not trying to bring up. This is just an analogy to the moral argument
fair
here.
enough.
So it seems like it's equally plausible to have free will under a naturalistic universe as an undiscovered law or something, as it is to have free will under a supernatural universe. And the same thing seems to be able to apply to morality. It seems just like you could have morality grounded in some supernatural thing. It would be equally plausible to have it grounded in an unknown natural thing that isn't a mind. I don't see why those would be different or why you could only have one under the supernatural if we don't have some kind of a proof of what that thing necessarily is. It could just be an unknown natural thing.
I think the key is the unknown part there. That with theism there is an answer for how this thing could work. With naturalism, it doesn't seem like there is an answer for how this thing could work. It's sort of just a okay, well this is how we think people should behave. But there's no foundation for saying that they need to behave this way or they must behave this way, especially runs contrary to how the rest of the natural world works. Like, why are we different? Why should we be? I mean, certainly we might prefer that people do that because if people act in, this particular way, then it makes our lives better, certainly more pleasant and enjoyable. So we want people to do that, but it's hard to see how there's any natural reason for saying that they should act in this particular way or that particular way.
But what do you mean when you say theism has an answer? Because from my perspective, it's essentially, it seems like theists have made up an answer. They can imagine that this is the case and think it's an answer. But I can say the same thing. Like, imagine it's a Platonic object or an undiscovered law of nature, and that doesn't seem to be one of those doesn't seem to be more supported than the other. They're just kind of things we're asserting. I don't see why that would be qualify as more of an answer than the undiscovered natural law or the Platonic object to say that it's a god.
Well, it's saying that, I mean, the moral argument is saying that if there is a God, then objective moral values can exist. That this is a possibility. Of course, if the first premise is not saying that he must have created moral values, but that if they do exist, then some sort of God created them because they can't come about from any other source. Um, and basically, all you need to do to support that is show that there's no natural way of arriving at objective moral values. So, unless there's a naturalistic way of arriving at objective moral values, then you have the first premise. Now, whether there's a God who created them or not, or excuse me, whether a God that exists decided to create them, is part of what the second premise is all about, and also about what any particular version of theism says. Their God did or didn't do, and how their God did or didn't do. But
Right, I would not object to that part. So for me, it seems like what you're saying when you present the moral argument would be essentially no more supported than if I said, if Platonic objects exist, then there are objective moral values and duties. There are objective moral values and duties, therefore Platonic objects exist. So I can make the assertion, the same valid argument, replace the noun God with Platonic moral objects or an undiscovered law of nature, and get the same conclusion. But the question is why would you think that a god would work as a better solution than Platonic objects or an undiscovered law of nature? It seems like both of those can work as equally well and have all the same problems and all the same benefits that a god could potentially have. I don't see an advantage that the god has that allows it to answer this question better than the other options.
I think that's in him or it or she or whoever creating humans for a purpose and saying this is how I've made you to function. This is what you need to do while you're here, on your time on Earth, and so forth. Um, I think the creation of beings for a purpose is what allows that to be different than simply just saying, well, this is how you are, because purpose crosses the crosses out of is, into something a bit more. So I think that's what allows for the difference.
All right, that's where I was asking earlier. Like, do you think you need a purpose for morality to exist? Because I think you can have morality without the purpose. I don't think you need that aspect of to get morality. I think morality can just be a law of nature. I don't think you need to have been created with some teleology to have an objective morality. Is that what you're saying? The difference is that you need that purpose to have it.
I don't know that it necessarily has to be purpose, but there needs to be something more than just this is the way things are. Because I mean, going back to the Kalam, if it's just the quantum vacuum uh, fluctuated and our universe began to exist, and this is the way things are. There's no ought there. It's just okay. The universe is this way, and that's how things are. So there's no moreness there. There's no way to get to objectivity from just we're a random fluctuation and our particles are arranged in this particular way, and that's all there is. Um,
How are you defining objectivity here?
I'm defining objectivity, at least in relation to moral values, as something that humans, if we're talking about humans, should do apart from any consideration of whether or not we think we should or not. So if you and I are part of the same tribe or we're part of different tribes, then um, there's rules on how we function in relation to another that we can come up with in relation to each other. Sort of more like social moral values that the rules that we decide to come up with. But an objective moral value would be something that you and I have to do or not do, regardless of whatever we come up with.
Right. So I define objective as independent of personal opinion, or so essentially independent of a mind,
Right.
which is why I think there's problems with a God since it does seem to be contingent on his mind. Um,
Yeah, but the difference between moral values being contingent on God and contingent on us is really a practical one because what we want to know is not are we defining these technically as subjective or objective? That's relatively uninteresting. The more interesting question is do we have the freedom to make up whatever moral values we feel like, or are there some things that we're subject to regardless of what we feel like? I think that's the real question.
how are those different? Because from my perspective, it seems like the question is morality made up by a mind's opinion? I think this is moral or immoral, or is it made up by something independent of a mind, which is what I would define as objective?
I guess we're interested in different questions because if it's created by God, if it's subjective to his mind, then the relevant questions there are going to be all sorts of things like how do we relate to God? Do we want to relate to God? And depending on what we think and can dive into Euthyphro, are those moral values dependent on his nature? Are they outside of his nature? So on and so forth. Those are the sorts of questions that we're going to be asking. Um, if they're simply dependent on what we want, then we're going to be asking questions more like, well, how do we want humanity to look? How do we want to shape the world around us? And if they're not dependent on anything outside of humanity, then we can basically do whatever we want. So how do we decide best how to move forward? And so they're really two separate sets of questions. Are the first one is how did God create humanity and how are we supposed to live? The second is how do we create humanity and how do we want to live? Um, so both are dependent on a question. Is it's a question of whether we are only dependent on ourselves within humanity or whether we're dependent on something outside.
How would that be different than if I asked, well, Hitler has this particular view of morality, and what we should do in order to accommodate his view of morality would be X, Y, and Z. Therefore, morality is I'm not sure what to say here because objective I think would be the goal is here trying to find well, what is an objective morality, true, independent of what we think. But it seems like what your view is no different from just labeling some being, some conscious being, saying, well, his opinion on morality is this, therefore that's what we should do. How is that different from just labeling any person, their definition or idea of morality is objective?
I mean, besides the obvious one that one of those beings created everybody else and the other one didn't. I mean, so there's a slight difference there between uh, God and any other human. But that would get back to the question of how humans were made and how the human machine functions best. And part of the whole problem with objective morality is the epistemological problem of how do we know what moral values are the best and not? Because, I mean, I mean, you and I, even though theists and atheists, we're going to both want to say, okay, well, Hitler's wrong. And there's some objective reason why he was wrong. And of course, because we've been talking now for a little over an hour, it's about time for Hitler to have been brought up. There's that rule that Hitler always gets brought up in serious conversations like
Yeah.
this.
Or
So
what's that law? There's a law specifically about
I
it.
know it is. I can't remember what it is. But we did the good thing. We haven't called each other that. So we've at least just talking about him neutrally. So we did the good side of the law. Um, Now I can't even remember what we were talking about. I got off sidetracked off on Hitler. Oh yeah.
Yeah, I was asking the
Um,
difference between your definition of morality as being grounded in God's opinion or nature, as opposed to be grounded in some other person.
um, I don't remember where I got off on Hitler with that, but I remember what I was, at least what I was saying immediately before that was you and I both agree that we want to say that Hitler was objectively wrong. The question is, how do we come about being able to say that there are certain things that ought not to be done? And um, if we say that there's a certain way humanity was meant to function and to operate, then we can say, okay, well, there's this. This is how we're not meant to um, go about doing things. Now I remember where I was going. We both want to say that he was wrong, and the big problem with trying to come about an objective morality, like trying to come up with laws in our legal system, is like, on what are we going to base all of this? Because it's trying to come to a conclusion of what is an objective morality, whether we believe it's founded in God or whether it's in nature, is a bit like sort of like all of us are looking at an eye chart. It's like, and we're all nearsighted. We can sort of agree that there's a big E at the top, and we can probably agree there is a chart. Um, and under the E, maybe we can look at the next couple of lines and say, all right, well, those are, we can probably agree that those say this and that. But once you start getting further on down the chart to the more and more detailed levels of things, then it starts getting a little more dicey. And some people say, well, this looks like an H, and some people say it looks like an E, and some people, and so forth. It's a D or an O. And that's where it gets really, really difficult. So um, the thing that makes it, it does make it a lot easier if you have a foundation for it to figure out what it is. And the problem that we have in all figuring out what an objective morality looks like, I think, is a bit that we're all a little bit nearsighted. We tend to think about ourselves. And so it makes trying to figure out or agreeing upon objective morality a little bit difficult.
Oh, absolutely. I totally agree. I think, but I see all the different models. I don't think theism is the strongest one. So, it's, again, my question would be like, why would you defining God's opinion about morality be any more objective or true than defining Hitler or some other random guy's opinion? Why is it that somehow, just because God created us, that his opinion is not is subjective morality or an arbitrary morality?
Because if morality is about how human beings were meant to function, and he's the one who made human beings to function in a particular way, then that's like asking the designer of a car engine why it functions best in this way. It's like, because that's how I made the engine, that's how it works. Um, Rather than asking the driver of the car why it should function this way. It's like there's a difference between the designer and the driver in that particular instance. And so that's why God and a human are different.
Well, I mean, in the case of an engine, like someone could design an engine and we can improve it and be like, oh, that, yeah, that's not really the best design. We can make it better. The same thing would seem to apply to God's opinion of morality, that he has this opinion of morality. He designed us in this way, but we're like, yeah, we don't really like that. Like maybe God designed us to be flooded occasionally on the earth a few times. And we don't like that. And we're saying that's not the best moral system. We can do it better. Why would his answer be right just because he made us? And that's the justification for morality. He made us, therefore he gets to define whatever it is.
Well, there's two questions there. The first one that you asked me to answer is, why is God's opinion different than a human's? And that's simply because designer, driver are different beings. But then there's the question of how do we try to, how can we say that God's particular version of morality is better than our version of morality? And I mean, that leads into all sorts of hairy questions, like how can you sort of reason outside of this. Like how can you question the system that you're based in? Like how can you see outside of the box that you're in? Like that becomes a little bit difficult. But if you get into the if you ignore all of those questions and just try to look at which one seems to be better, um, I think one in which if you look at like what is the core moral of or core values of how you're supposed to live and treat each other, say, given by Jesus or something, then it's like, okay, well, you're supposed to treat other people as you would want to be treated. It's like, all right, well, that sounds pretty good. I mean, if you're going to go on just simply how does it sound to me, that sounds like a pretty good place to start. Um, because what you're doing in that is assigning real value to other humans and not acting in a way that puts yourself first. And I think that's part of the core of what Christian morality was meant to be is selflessness and acting that way towards other people. Whereas um, in if there isn't something of like that, then there's no reason that we need to or have to. And I think that's part of the should that you get on Christian morality that does make it better than simply you can act in whichever way you feel like, and um, it's just an is, and there's no ought.
I actually really agree with that approach that we should just look at trying to find out what is the best system of being selfless in a way. And I totally think that Jainism has the highest moral standard of any big religion. So I would say that Christianity doesn't seem to have the moral high ground, especially because all the killing that the God does in the Old Testament, not the best view from my perspective. It seems like if we're just looking objectively without trying to start with a conclusion, then it's the best moral system seems to be the one that doesn't advocate for killing ever. Like Jainism is absolute, complete nonviolence in every case. And so that seems to be a morally superior model. How would, by your definition, how would you be able to assess which model was better independently of just presuming the God?
I don't even have a clue how to start on something like how to independently assess which moral system is better, because the problem that you're going to that is immediate problem you're going to have is what is your standard. And so then we're back on the discussion that we have right now. Is there a God? And if there is a God, then which God is it? Because if there's not a God, things are going to look one way. If there is a God, it's going to depend vastly on which one that is. So I don't even know how you would even attempt to do that in a neutral way, except by saying my gut says X or my gut says Y, which gets us back to the eye chart problem that all of our guts say the same sort of thing in some very, very general ways. But once you get to anything that's even remotely complicated, then all bets are off and people start seeing things wildly differently. So I don't have a clue how you'd compare those in a neutral way because you're just on gut feeling and those are different.
Sure, I would say moral naturalism is the position I go to, and in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy outlines what that means. We assess morality in the same way we assess scientific claims, essentially. And we'd say we look at moral intuition and moral progress, we try to plot it out and describe the pattern and then create a principle. And if the principle is true, we can predict how our intuitions and things are going to change over time and given other variables. And that's how we would try to predict the correct model of morality given a naturalistic perspective. We look at the evidence and see where it leads, essentially.
I mean, that sounds great, but everything hinges on what do you mean by moral progress? Which way is forward? And I want forward, but which way is forward?
Yep.
And so we're back to this question again.
Sure.
So, yeah, the method sounds great. It's just, and I don't disagree with it. You could probably even try to think of what laws and practices you'd want to create within theism, because there's a lot of times some fairly wide boundaries depending on how you read stuff. And you could apply the same methodology there. It's just your definition of progress is going to look a little bit different.
Sure. Yeah. It's a good point to transition on the last one, the resurrection argument.
So Jesus of Nazareth was a first century rabbi who announced the kingdom of God and came into conflict with the Jewish leaders. They put him on trial and delivered him over to the Roman authorities for crucifixion, and he died. And shortly thereafter, individuals and groups claimed that they saw him alive after his death. I think the best explanation of the events of his death and what happened shortly thereafter is the theory that God raised Jesus from the dead. Um, Basic facts are Jesus died due to crucifixion. Disciples believe Jesus appeared to him after his death. The church persecutor Paul converted. The skeptic James converted, and the tomb of Jesus was found empty.
Can you say those again one more time slowly?
Oh, I'm so sorry. Uh, Jesus
Jesus
died
was
due to crucifixion.
crucifixion.
Disciples believe Jesus appeared to them after his death. So appearances, disciples. Conversion of Paul. Conversion of James, and empty tomb.
All right. And you think the best explanation of those five, I'm assuming there's probably more of those, like the citing of the 500 or whatever in addition to those, but just going with
Yeah, I
these
mean,
five.
there's
Do you
I mean,
actually,
everybody uses the same data. They just break it up differently. Craig breaks it up differently than Habermas or
yeah,
Habermas
do
and
you
like
actually have like a complete list? Because I've been trying to find like, what is the complete list? I want to find it because
If you want the complete list, I think you need to go to Habermas. He's the one
Habermas.
that he's the one who puts. He started the whole minimal facts thing, but he started with a whole bunch of facts.
Hmm.
Um,
Do you know where, like, which book in that one?
Gosh, I don't remember. I've just because of talking points, I try not to expand them to too many. Lycona gets really simple. He only goes with the first three.
Yeah.
Craig breaks them up differently.
Yeah, I've been looking for like the complete list so I can make a, because one of my friends, Doug Pine Creek, he makes an analogy of the flying man, and he goes through, well, if you came across this book and it said there was a flying man, a man who just flew across the Grand Canyon or whatever, would you put it in the fiction section or the reality section? And then he adds each one of the facts in one at a time and says, well, now would you put it in the fiction section or the reality section? Well, now would you put it in the fiction section or reality section? It's a really interesting game. I absolutely love it. So I've been trying to find like a complete list of all the facts to actually go through that in detail.
it's You need to look into Habermas, but I would suggest a few other common ones that, well, maybe not common, but you've got N.T. Wright's argument for the disciples would not have come to believe in the resurrection unless it actually happened because resurrection didn't happen and the definition was different. He basically proves a historical negative that no one had the idea of resurrection happening except Jews, and they only believed it happened to everyone at the end of the world. So no individual person would ever resurrect because that's not what the word meant.
Would that
So Christians,
contradict with like Lazarus and Jesus' own prophecy?
no, because a resuscitation, somebody coming back to life, is just you come back to life and then you die again. A resurrection is you come back to life, but it's not back to life. It's towards your glorified end of the world sort of state. Like you've passed through death and come out the other side, not you've come back to life and you're going to die again. It's sort of like think end of the Bible, last couple chapters of Revelation. Like Jesus went ahead to that state, not just he came back like Lazarus and then died again.
Did Lazarus die again? I thought he was raised to heaven. Somebody was raised to heaven.
They saw him in the afterlife. It's well, it depends on which Lazarus you're talking about. There's Luke 16 Lazarus and then there's John Lazarus. But the one in Luke he's seen in the afterlife. He doesn't actually come back to this earth. The one in John, he hops out of the tomb in bandages, and we assume he died. It's not ever discussed. You don't see him again.
Okay, and you mentioned a few other facts you wanted to mention.
The changing of the day of worship from Saturday to Sunday, from the Sabbath until the first day of the week. If you think of the Gospels and how crazy Jews were about worshiping on the Sabbath and the Sabbath only, Christians who still called themselves Jews for a long period of time switched. Why would they switch days of worship? There had to have been a reason for it. That's another argument. The origin and growth of Christianity and why it took the shape it did. All three of those get into really big historical questions, and they're not easy to give a one or two word answer for, and they usually take their own discussions or debates.
All right, cool. Yeah, so that's a good place for me to start.
So there's three more.
Yeah, for sure. And so it seems like the best explanation for all these things you're saying is an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving being who raised a specific guy from the dead.
I think it makes a lot better sense than any of the other alternative hypotheses. Yeah.
Because from my perspective, it just seems like all of those things can be explained naturalistically. We have examples of all of this happening throughout all different cultures and all different religions all throughout time. All of those seem like there's a hoof print in the snow, probably a horse, Probably not an all-powerful being who created a hoof print in the snow. So, for example, the crucifixion, Romans said that all the time, not a surprise. Disciples believed, happens like, what's his name? Mormonism guy, Jonathan Smith. Disciples believe all the time. Conversions of people who are against you or fight against you, again, that happens all the time in all kinds of ideologies. I think there's actually cases in Mormonism of the same thing, where someone who was trying to persecute Mormonism converted to it. Conversion of Paul, that would be like a bereavement delusion. So if you have someone who persecutes a specific group, like the Nazis or other kinds of Chinese government officials who persecute different religions, they become super guilt-ridden and can see visions of the deities of people or the deities that were talked about by the people who they were persecuting, because it's just such a big part of their life that they were persecuted from so long and told about it for so long. It grew like the plant the seed in someone's mind kind of a thing. Conversion of James, I'm not familiar with that one as much. Empty tomb, there's lots of empty tombs all over the place. People could be moved, grave robbed. Jesus was dumped in a giant burial thing. Lots of different possibilities to explain there. Disciples would not come to believe it was a resurrection unless it was actually a resurrection. I don't see why that would be the case. Like, people believe all kinds of very silly things, and came up with completely new ideas that had nothing to do with reality, like Jonathan Smith translating Egyptian from tablets. Like, no one believed that before Jonathan Smith. He totally just made it up. But it doesn't seem like it would be strange just because no one in Christianity believed it beforehand, and now it's a huge movement in Christianity. Changing the day of worship, I'm definitely going to have to look into that one. Origin and growth of Christianity. Christianity's not even the fastest growing religious group. The fastest one is Falun Gong. So I don't think they didn't have a resurrection. So I don't think that would require a resurrection. So it doesn't seem like any of those things are particularly spectacular or couldn't just be explained by naturalistic causes.
Well, I don't even want to address the last three. I'm just bringing that up because you were looking for other facts, because those are going to take longer to get into, to try to explain why those happened historically. But sticking with the first five, like, even if all of your points carried, and I want to go through them one by one, except the first one, because I think we both agree he died, right?
Yep.
Okay, good. That's one. But that's a relatively uninteresting one. It only makes the other ones potentially count, because he has to die if he's going to rise from the dead.
So. It was doppelganger. They crucified his brother. He's fine.
Right. And he just managed to not have anyone know that he had this twin, which is a really interesting theory, but seems rather unlikely.
Yeah.
Somebody would have known. Even if I grant all of the things that you've said, and I don't grant any of them, but even if I grant all of those for those other four, now you've got four different hypotheses for how to explain each one of these facts. And it's getting really ad hoc when you're making up a different solution for each one of the facts. You need, ideally, one hypothesis that's going to cover all of them. Or maybe two that are sort of related, so that it's kind of like 1.5 or something like that. But having a different hypothesis for each one of them is, historically, now you're getting really ad hoc, and it doesn't work. So maybe let's go through them one at a time.
Well, actually, let me address that one?
Yeah.
So it seems like if we come to a field, it was covered in snow, and we see lots and lots of different tracks, we can say, well, it was caused by, there was a horse, raccoon, squirrel, rabbit, all these fox, and say, oh, these are caused by all a bunch of different things. Or could all be caused by a magical alien who just wanted to melt the snow and make it look like plants, or make it look like all the different animals ran through. Based on your argument, it would be more parsimonious to conclude the alien did it, even though it seems that would be completely backwards. It seems like if we just use the naturalistic hypotheses, where there's a bunch of different animals all ran through to create the tracks, that seems to be far more reasonable than to say there was one alien who did it by just melting the snow, even though it's definitely possible. Wouldn't that contradict your argument that you need just one explanation to explain all of it?
Well, you really do have one explanation. You're just breaking it down unnecessarily far. Your explanation is that there are animals that live in the woods, and when it snows, their tracks show up because they walk in the snow instead of on the ground. And that's really your argument right there. So it's not actually that complicated. It's not that you have to posit the existence of a whole bunch of animals that, previously we didn't know exist. It's like, they're already there. It's just, you can see the tracks now because it snowed.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So it's really just one argument.
But wouldn't that same thing apply to the case of the resurrection? Because all this is really one argument too. It's just saying, here are a bunch of the brain malfunctions humans have, just like different animals. And we know all of these exist, and we're just positing these little brain malfunction in these cases.
you're positing different ones for different people, and their situations are different. So how about we go through these one by one, and then we'll come back to this and see if it still applies, because I want to hear what your theories are on how each one of these works.
Okay.
So the disciples, the appearances of disciples. So the disciples believe that, I mean, they certainly claimed that Jesus appeared to them. I mean, that's, you see that all throughout the New Testament. I mean, you're not going to have a Christianity that's talking about the resurrection of Jesus unless they started talking about the resurrection of Jesus. I mean, they certainly claimed it. Everything hinges on whether they believed it. And I think the fact
I'm willing to
that,
grant they believed it too. So
okay, well, then that's easy. So what caused them to believe it then?
brain fart delusion, same thing people believe in all religions for.
But why would they claim that they believed it and then claim that Jesus appeared to them? Claim that, like, what would make them claim that Jesus appeared to me? He appeared to all of us together. Um, he did these things. Like, if you want to get into the Gospels, and he ate with us. On and on and on, numerous times over a period of time.
Bereavement
What would
delusion.
cause them to? Huh?
Bereavement delusion. So it's a super common feature among humans who have significant others. If they die, I think 15% of the population can see or hear the person after they have died. It happens all the time, happens in groups, happens with all kinds of things. It's the group particular examples are really interesting is if you have, for example, a family in the dining room after a loved one has died and they hear something in the kitchen and they all think it sounds like or reminds them of their dead loved one. And so they all claim to have seen or heard their dead loved one in those instances. The same with like Ouija boards or whatever, when people see like, oh, they saw a ghost. Well, really it was just, they had some kind of unexplained event and they all attributed it to the ghost, and which is why they came to the conclusion of believing it was a ghost. Same thing applies in bereavement delusion. Same thing applies in all kinds of instances, like UFO cases where lots of people see the same kinds of UFOs. Really, it was just a balloon or whatever. All of those same cases can be explained purely naturalistically of, well, why did all these people come to say they saw a UFO or a person, a dead loved one, or a ghost? Same thing. It's just a human byproduct of evolution, the type 1 and type 2 errors. We know the brain does that all the time.
Several things there. First, delusion is something that people believe contrary to the evidence. I think you're conflating that with hallucination, which is where you believe that you have seen something or heard something or whatever. It is some sort of a sensory perception that does not comport with reality. Whereas a delusion is you convince yourself that this thing happened, even though it didn't. So they're a little bit different.
Well, I'd say you
Um,
have a hallucination and then you convince yourself that it was real, which makes it into a delusion.
well, if you have a hallucination, you don't have to convince yourself because you had some sort of an experience, even though it wasn't outside of your own mind.
Well, yeah, that's usually what happens is you have some experience, like you saw a bright light, and that was the hallucination. And then from that bright light, you convinced yourself of a delusion that it was a specific kind of a deity or something. And so it's usually the two are really tied together in like the UFO cases specifically.
So, if we're talking hallucinations, a hallucination is very much like a dream. It occurs only inside your own mind. The problem is that hallucinations do not happen in groups ever. There's a book called Hallucinations, Science and Idiosyncratic Perception, and I think it's 2004. And the author surveyed everything that was in the medical literature at the time, and there were zero counts of any group hallucinations ever happening. And you can really sort of see why, because if it's something that occurs inside your own brain, I mean, how are you and I going to share a hallucination? And it occurs in our own brain. And I mean, unless we're living in the movie Inception, and then we have dream sharing. But I mean, we had dream sharing in the movie, and then there was the suitcase with the machine and the tubes. And if there's no tubes, there's no dream sharing. And so group hallucinations don't happen. So saying that they saw Jesus in groups is not something that can be accounted for by hallucinations. You need some other sort of hypothesis for that.
Well, just to jump in there, well, they do. We have specifically numbers of cases like cause mass hysteria and specifically folie du and folie tree or some French word that we do have actual examples of hallucinations happening to multiple people at the same time where some kind of sensory input causes a reaction in the brain to produce hallucinations. So it is a hallucination as a result of some actual sensory input. Like if you flash bright lights in people's eye, they can both have epilepsy and have a similar kind of hallucination because of whatever they were watching at the time was the same thing. So if two people are watching a movie about ghosts or whatever, and they have an epileptic seizure at the same time, they can both have visions of ghosts in their seizure and see the same thing. So
There's
we
there's a difference there between vision and hallucination. Vision, whether it's at least as it's distinguished by people when they talk about this, a vision is something that's going to occur outside of one's own mind, whether it's real or not. We can say it's a fake one. Maybe it's like the bright light that then triggered something
right.
inside
So I'll
one's own mind or
just
not.
clarify my language there. So they're both hallucinating the same thing. They're both hallucinating ghosts because they had been watching a movie about ghosts, and so their brain was primed for ghosts. And when they had an epileptic seizure, the hallucination that was produced in their brain was the same kind of hallucination from the seizure, just having those pathways primed from previously watching a movie about the same thing. But they both had similar hallucinations. It's called folia do, fairly common medical procedure. So we do actually have evidence of those happening.
The question is going to be, was there sort of some sort of an external thing that happened or not? And if so, how do you end up with, or if so, then what was the thing that was out there? And if not, then how do you end up with this sort of thing? But
All right.
going
So in the
with the,
context of the resurrection, I'd say there was some
yeah,
external thing that happened, and they attributed that to Jesus. So it wasn't just purely a hallucination they all had at the same time. It was there was some external thing which caused them to have the hallucination.
and then well, the question is, what was that sort of thing? And it apparently happened more than once because it happened to both individuals and groups over a period of time. So, what was this recurring thing that caused them to have these sorts of things, and for the disciples to believe this, um, and believe it strongly enough that they're willing to carry on preaching in the face of suffering and death? It has to, I think, be something a little bit more than a suggestion if they're going to continue to act in face of what they're looking at, which isn't terribly pleasant.
Well, what do you mean? Because when people see a bird, they say, "Oh, God sent that bird to answer my prayer," or whatever. Or when they see a flash of light, "Oh, that was God." It seems like when people see unexplained events, they attribute it to whatever their ideology happens to be, whatever their background knowledge is. And so there could be
Sure.
lots of different events that all of the disciples all attributed to the same cause, even though they're completely unrelated. And that doesn't seem to be like a particularly uh, outlandish hypothesis because it's the same thing that happens in all kinds of religions and ghost stories and UFOs. They say, "Oh, that was caused by an alien," or people who think the government is watching them. "Oh, the government did that because they were watching me," or something. And it's just completely unrelated events that they're all attributing to the same cause, and their brain is then interpreting in that way. Seems like the same thing could apply to the apostles and the people who saw Jesus.
Difference is most people who see birds aren't usually willing to die for the hypothesis that God sent that bird just for them, but also the disciples are not predisposed to believe that Jesus had risen from the dead or that God was even happy with him because he was crucified. And messiahs don't get crucified. The Messiah, by definition, is God's anointed one who's come there to set things right in God's name. You don't get crucified by the Gentiles if you're the Messiah. So, I mean, shortly after his crucifixion, they're all hiding, uh, not because they believe in the power of God, but because they believe they backed the wrong person, and Rome was coming for them next. There's a reason they were hiding, so they were not in any way, shape, or form predisposed to believe that things were that 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 Jesus was the one they were waiting for. And I think things like the example of Thomas points towards that because Thomas is like, yeah, all you other guys are saying this, and no, I'm not going with this. So, I mean, even one of the disciples was a skeptic for a while, and then was eventually turned. But uh, you have people like Thomas, and then later, outside of that, Paul and James, that just like, yeah, we're not tracking with this. So I don't think the disciples wanted or expected to see Jesus risen from the dead. At most, if they had seen something they thought was a vision of him or something like that, they would have concluded that he died a righteous death as a martyr, but they never would have said that he was a Messiah, much less resurrected, because Messiahs don't get killed. That's not part of Jewish thinking.
Right. So the first thing is when you say they're not predisposed predisposed to conclude that he rose from the dead. Well, I disagree with that because we know that all humans are. Bereavement delusion is when you see someone who you care about who's died, you see them after they've died. So we know that all humans, like 15% of humans, are predisposed to see that, especially in cases where there's someone really important to you, like a loved one or a leader of some kind. So I'd say that since all humans are predisposed to that, it's a really common feature in humanity. I think that's like one of the really common things we already know about. Like, oh, there's a rabbit footprint's probably a rabbit kind of a thing. I don't see why that would be particularly strange and they wouldn't die for it. Well, we know lots of people who die for all kinds of strange beliefs. Like we know that Buddhists light themselves on fire just to advocate for peace or whatever. And there are people who are like UFO followers who take lots of criticism, lose their jobs, do all kinds of have lots of pain in their life because they advocate for these kinds of beliefs and support it so rigorously. So they're willing to sacrifice much of their lives for things that we consider quite ridiculous. So I don't see that as either of those to be particularly strange among humanity. They seem to be really common, both sacrificing yourself and being predisposed to see loved ones from the dead.
Well, the first one, most of those, you said 15% of humanity sees or experiences something like that. The vast majority of people who do are, according to the book I was referencing earlier, are women who are, I think, 65 or older, who have recently lost a loved one, specifically a longtime spouse. The disciples don't really fit that mold. It's not. They're not elderly females. They're not bereaving the loss of a spouse. Yes, they lost their teacher, but when they lost their teacher, it was believing that he had been discredited and it was not actually who they thought he was, which is why they were hiding. But to your second point, that people often do strange things and will die for things, and sometimes courageously, sometimes foolishly. They absolutely do. But the difference with the disciples is that they claim that they were eyewitnesses. That doesn't mean that they're right. It just means that they would have known whether they were right or not. Nobody's just going to, pull one over on them because it's like they said they saw this. So they either knew they did or knew they didn't. And the fact that they continued preaching in the face of, suffering and persecution, it gives them a long time to think about, do I really believe this or not? Because, your buddy dies and it's like, for this thing, it's like, well, he might not have had much of a choice. He would have just, did this thing. But now you've got a few years to think about this. Like, do I want to keep doing this? And they'd had a lot of time to think about that, and they kept doing it anyway. So they don't really fit the bill of most people, whether the UFO nuts or whether the Buddhists who are, sacrificing themselves for a worthy cause. They were a little bit different than that.
I'm not sure what you mean, because in the case of the similarities to like flat earthers are persecuted quite a bit for their belief. And they see their friends being persecuted and lose their jobs, and be religious beliefs the same thing. People will have religious beliefs and someone in your family will be fired, but you'll still advocate for your religious belief and be killed for it because it's something you're really passionate about. And so anything that some people are really passionate about, even hobbies, same thing. People can get fired for certain hobbies, and other people will stand behind them and also lose their jobs or lives in many cases across the world, especially in the Middle East, for the same kinds of a thing. So I don't see them as being particularly different from the rest of humanity in that respect. The second thing was, I agree that the vast majority of people who see bereavement delusions are women who have long lost loved ones. But obviously, the amount of women who have loved ones is significantly more than people who follow leaders of cults or other group leaders. So there's going to be more of those instances than the ones who follow group leaders and see visions. But there are a significant number of examples of people who have seen a group leader die and have visions afterward, like Santi Sai Baba is a classical example. Huge Hindu guy who died, and people claimed that he came back from the dead a lot, and there's lots of thousands of people who claimed he came back in the same day. So that doesn't seem to be a particularly strange occurrence in human history either.
Well, I meant to compare them to young males, not specifically the religious people. But again, even if they had seen something, some bright light or something or whatever, what it would have done is trigger a belief within their current worldview, which on Judaism would have been that they had a vision or something, and like he was now with God as a righteous martyr or something like that. Um, Interestingly, there is one Jewish scholar who believes in the resurrection. I don't know if you come across his name. It's Pincus Lapide.
How do you
Um,
spell that?
right. Pinchas, and his last name is Laipde, I think,
All right, I'll check him out.
something like that. He thinks God did raise Jesus from the dead, but does not believe in Christianity. He thinks God raised Jesus from dead as a righteous man who had been treated wrongly. Um, that's the sort of thing that the disciples would have believed, staying within their current, Old Testament worldview, that Jesus would have been raised as a righteous man who'd been treated wrongly by the Gentile authorities, or something like that. They would have believed something like that, not switch to saying the end times are here and God has instituted the resurrection. Oh, and by the way, he's brought one person forward and not everybody else. And so they changed their theology from anything that had been believed by Jews up to that point. Um, so those are different. And to the flat earthers, there's a difference between being convinced of a theory, a dumb one, and which I no doubt think you think the same of the resurrection. The same thing applies. Being convinced of a dumb theory and saying, "I saw the edge of the earth. It's over there." Um, it's a little different. And basically, they were in the camp of saying, "Yeah, I saw him risen from the dead, and I'll still die for it." That's different.
So the first case was how would you explain that many people do come to completely strange interpretations of new worldviews? Like, for example, Mormonism, in case that one, obviously he made it up, but many people do genuinely come to believe or transition to different worldviews through spontaneous events. Like, it's not like they've already known about this and been thinking about it for a long time. They essentially just pray and their prayer gets answered and like, oh, wow, I now believe this completely new thing. That seems to happen all the time in humanity. So the fact that they weren't primed to believe that the resurrection would occur doesn't seem to be a surprise given the fact that many religions start in that same similar kind of a way. Um, why do you think that that would be impossible given the apostles?
Impossible? No. Highly unlikely? Yes. It's the same thing I was talking about with all four of the, facts 2 through 5 together, that when you start trying to put all these things together and coming up with a solution for each one individually, and then you try to put all those together, it gets really ad hoc. We're doing the same thing now, except that we're taking the second one, the disciples believe Jesus appeared to them, and not even taking that as a full thing by itself and trying to come up with a theory for it. We're breaking it down to the individual parts. And this one is just, where do they come up with a new theory? So there's, where do they come up with a new theory? Why does this particular theory take the form that they believe they saw him? Why is it that this, whatever it is, occurred to individuals and groups in multiple places, multiple times? Why were they willing to die for it? Why is it? There's a lot of different elements to there. And if you just separate out this one part of this one fact out of the whole story, now you're like, well, I can explain 2D. Yeah, but we're trying to explain all of those parts together and all of the facts together with a single theory. So yeah, you can explain 2D by itself, but what about the rest of it? And that's sort of the thing. We're looking for one theory that explains all of the historical data together.
Well, doesn't as far as I know, mine does exactly that. It's kind of like if we, my example, if we see a big open field with lots of different kinds of footprints, we can explain each of the footprints by a different natural thing we already know existed. We could explain the experience of the all the different facts you listed by different natural things we know existed. Even though they're different, they're still just part of that same natural hypothesis that we already expect to be there. The same conditions apply in the case of the apostles as do in all the other cases that we see these happen. It doesn't seem to be particularly strange in any case. So it seems from my perspective that I am trying to present a single theory that does explain all those things, just like the theory that there's a bunch of animals that live in the forest and they all just ran across the field.
And your theory is, could you just state it in like maybe a single sentence or two?
Um, they had the same kinds of delusions that all other humans have that exist, that created the same kinds of beliefs that all other humans believe.
Delusions being that they convinced themselves that this was true. Was there some sort of
Uh,
thing that kicked this off? Was it a hallucination? Did they just decide this? What started it?
Was it, I'd say the same kinds of things that started every other kind of religion. So my category wouldn't be specifically one of those because each of those would just be a different animal, a rabbit, a horse, or a fox, whatever. But any combination of those things would still just be there are animals that live in the forest and they just ran through the field. But it seems like any combination of those things would still be pretty mundane, just like saying there's a bunch of animals that live in the forest and they run through the field. Because as long as all of those things would apply to humans in general,
So
commonly.
they was there something that kickstarted it and they sort of went along with it, or did they sort of lead the charge and decide we're going to do this thing? Like, I mean, I'm trying to get at the question of was it a hallucination or something, or was it a or an ex hallucinations their own brains? And I'm already saying that can't happen. Was it a something external? This thing that's they thought was a vision that occurred multiple times over a period of time to various ones of them individually or in groups, and then they considered that it was this that they thought it was this new theology that God was doing this new thing that He was doing, and that's what explained it. Is that what you're going with, or is it
The way I would explain it, I would say that only natural things happened, and their brains interpreted those natural things in weird ways, just like everyone does.
okay? I'm I find it very unlikely that there is any sort of a natural thing that could have caused that sort of belief in them. But let's take that as the hypothesis that we're working with, and then let's go on to the other facts and
Oh
see
yeah, and
how
I'm,
that
I'm
one
including
works for the
all of the
rest of it.
facts here. All of the facts are the same thing. The same thing are explained by the fact that they natural things happened in all these different instances, and they interpreted each of those natural things to fit into their emotionally driven worldview, just like every other religious belief throughout all humanity.
Okay, so if that's what they did, then the next step is to answer the question: what about Paul and James? Why would they convert?
Exact same
Uh,
thing.
those are people who were not predisposed to. Paul was persecuting Christians, and James was Jesus' brother who disbelieved in Jesus during his ministry. So both of them were very much against, just hopping on this new Christian bandwagon thing, uh, because they'd been against it for a while. And actually, Paul didn't start persecuting Christians until after Christianity became a thing. So he may not have liked Jesus' theology ahead of time, but it's not like, hey, I'm hearing this new thing that they're doing. No, he heard the new thing that they're doing, started persecuting them, and then flipped. And James had been skeptical of his brother the whole time. And then, I mean, basically, he flipped, and which is, I think, a much more interesting question than Paul, because it's sort of like, if you have a brother, what would cause you to believe that he was God in the flesh? It's like, that's going to take quite a lot. It's not like he was the disciples who maybe like, oh, mourning the death of their teacher and, beloved teacher, and let's create this new theology that's okay. It's like James tried to get Jesus to expose himself as an idiot, so he'd stop embarrassing the family and go get killed. We don't need you around. You're messing with the family. Go away. Um, and then James flipped and became the leader of early Christianity, and it's like, wait, what? So those are problems. And then you tack onto that as well. It's like, how did the tomb end up getting empty? Where'd the body go? So all of those take the disciples had some sort of experience that they saw multiple times and have no idea what that would even be, and then deluded themselves. Even if that implausible situation happened, now you've got these other three things which don't fit with that at all. And so nothing really meshes together.
Well, again, I just see those as all just different animals in the forest: the rabbit, the hare, the fox, whatever. So in the case of Paul, it's just a bereavement delusion caused by his persecution. We know that Nazis had similar kinds of visions of Yahweh from after persecuting the Jews and converted to Christianity. Similar stories exist in China for different kinds of persecution or when Japan were persecuting Chinese people and all those kinds of cases. So we have similar cases of people doing persecuting and then seeing visions of the leader or the people they persecuted and having conversion stories. So that's a fairly common thing. So that'd just be like another animal in the forest. And in the case of James, I'm not very familiar with the story of James, so I can't really say much about it, but I'd still say it's probably just a natural phenomenon because we know family members who don't like each other or can come to like each other after their death or become a, attached to certain kinds of ideology. I don't see that as being particularly strange. I'd have to know more about the story to give a more detailed answer. But again, that'd just be another animal in the forest. I don't see that as all of those are just different animals in the forest leaving different tracks.
Whether it's not exactly, I don't think the animal in the forest thing works quite like you think it does. But the James story is, I mean, he didn't persecute Jesus, so he wasn't like actively opposing him. And technically, Paul didn't persecute Jesus, at least as far as he ever said, because he
Right.
seemed to
He
be
was
pretty open about
persecuting
his
the
past.
Christians, and the Christians were
Yeah,
just worshiping Jesus. And so the same thing would be because the Nazis were persecuting the Jews,
right,
not
right, right.
persecuting Yahweh.
Um, right. I was just making the point that he didn't persecute Jesus himself,
Right.
but
Yeah.
because I was talking about it in relation to James,
Right.
and so
Because yeah, he never met Jesus or saw him. He only came through a vision and then met James and Peter afterwards. Right.
well that we know of, he probably saw him at some point because he was in Jerusalem and Jesus was teaching there, so he probably heard him at some point. But yeah, James was a brother, and there's not a whole lot of information we have on James from the New Testament. There's Mark 3, Mark 6, John 7, where James is basically like, yeah, I don't. It's basically pretty clear that James doesn't believe in him, and not something you'd really make up about the leader of your movement. And Josephus records his death probably in AD 62. So something caused the flip, and the only thing that we have is the record of his appearance in 1 Corinthians 15:7. Said then he appeared to James, and so James said that like, okay, look, Jesus appeared to me. So you have somebody who was biologically related to this guy and didn't believe in him, and then said, yeah, I believe he was actually God in the flesh and appeared to me, and I'm willing to die for this. Um, and if there had been any sort of like, crap Jesus had gotten into growing up or whatever, he didn't really fit the bill. I mean, his brother would have known it if anybody else did. So he doesn't fit the, oh, well, there was a light sort of a thing that it wouldn't have worked on the disciples to begin with. It clearly didn't work on Thomas, at least not at the beginning. And then he flipped later. And then there was the whole, and then Paul doesn't fit the bill, James doesn't fit the bill, and then you're still left with the question of where'd the body go? Because somebody had to get rid of it. And if it's one of the disciples, then they would have known it was true. But you already said that you believed that they believed it. So it's like, who moved the body? Who got rid of that? Somebody had to. So it's like none of these pieces fit in any sort of a naturalistic way, unless you want to put, three or four, five hypotheses together, which many of them don't work well on their own.
Right. I'd still see that as just 3 or 4 or 5 animals running through the forest. But would you say that you don't think that you could find similar cases in other religions all throughout the world of people who were family members who didn't agree with the person or didn't like them and then later became a disciple and were willing to die for him? You don't think we'll be able to find many of those cases throughout human history?
I'm sure you probably could. That I would argue that the quality of it's different. Believing that um, somebody is worth following, and I'm going to attach onto this thing, and the exactness of what James believed about Jesus is probably going to be a bit different. But even if you find that, now how do you have all these other ones? And then you've got the disciples, and you've got Paul, and you've got the empty tomb. And so when you put all the things together, you're left with this sort of there's not really a good way out without saying that a whole bunch of things that aren't connected all came together. Whereas in your animal story, well, they're all connected because they're animals in the forest, and that's where animals are. And even though their feet look different, they're still animals in the forest, and it's just snow. Whereas you're having to imagine different sorts of things um, that don't really fit. It's like, well, animal in the forest. Like, why are there alligator tracks here? Alligators don't live in the forest. It's like things that just don't fit.
What do you mean by
And
don't fit? Because all of the examples I've given are just common human kind of known delusions, hallucinations, fallacies, biases, whatever combination of those things you want to use. They're all just known failures of the human brain that I'm using here. So none of them seem particularly out of place.
okay, where'd the body go?
Somebody took it.
Who would take the body and who would not? Like, for what purpose? So now it's they're having hallucinations. people convert for random reasons, and random person took the body and just decided never to say anything.
Well, I assume they took the body before the visions.
Okay, but why would they not say anything?
People take bodies for all kinds of reasons and don't say anything. There's lots of bodies are stolen from graves all the time, especially during that time period. Not particularly. Uh, it's actually more rare to have a grave than it is to have someone take someone from the grave.
The indication is that he was put in somewhere that was fairly well known. People have known where it was. It's not like it was odd, and um, I doubt that it would have been easy to just steal it. In all likelihood, there probably were guards there. That's another explanation. But even if you did manage to steal the body, it's like then you'd have to. First, the question is why. It's not like he was rich. I mean, and even the soldiers took his clothes. I mean, maybe you're after the spices and stuff in that, but why would you take the body? You just leave the body, take the spices, and maybe the linen cloth that he was wrapped in. You don't need a body. That's a lot of work for not much. You take the valuable stuff and leave. If your goal was to pull off a hoax, I mean, that was a pretty neat trick, though it still would have required the additional things that caused hallucinations, which I don't know how you'd pull that off. If your goal was monetary gain and the Christians started preaching that Jesus rose from the dead, guarantee the Jewish leaderships would have paid really good money for the body of Jesus if you could produce it. So there doesn't seem to be any logical reason to say, well, this is what probably happened. This is a reason why somebody would do that. There's at best you're saying, well, somebody did something unexpected for a random reason that we have no idea what it is.
Well, I'd say body snatching was just a common thing in the Roman Empire during then, along with grave robbing and looting. So I wouldn't say it was unknown reason. Just people robbed graves all the time.
Robbing graves is robbing for stuff. Like, why do you take the body? Like, you want a ring that they have, or anything of value. What do you need decaying human flesh for that's been torn apart by flogging and been nailed to a cross? Like, that's relatively not valuable, and kind of messy.
Yeah,
So
there's a term for it. It's called body snatching. That's also a thing that would happen back then for lots of different reasons. They'd use it for medicinal reasons, whether or not it actually worked, or to sell it, or to eat it in some cases. There's all kinds of reasons. But grave robbing and body snatching were not particularly uncommon.
so we've got grave robbing and or body snatching by a random person at a tomb that not everybody would agree with, but I would argue that probably was at least being watched, if not guarded, just because he was a bit notorious. Um, Famous to the people who liked him, notorious to the people who didn't. Um, then you've got the random sorts of lights or whatever that caused hallucinations in people in individual groups for multiple times over multiple locations that caused them to change their theology, and then people someone who persecuted the church would be willing to convert to this strange thing. All of this convinced him, and then his own brother was like, "Yeah, I want to hop on board with this too." It's like there's not really a good theory here.
Well, I mean,
I
that seems to be
think
the same as like all the other religions. Like, I don't see any difference. Like, all of them have the same features of lots of people see visions that they attribute to this being, both in groups and individuals. Lots of them have converts who are both persecuting them and who were related and didn't agree with them. Lots of them have cases of mysterious events they can't explain. Like, well, what happened to the golden thing that Jonathan Smith read? They all have very strange cases of where did they go? Um, so I've seen all of those cases seem to be the exact same as many other religions. I don't see any specific difference there.
I think things like Joseph Smiths and the golden plates and all that stuff disappearing is slightly different. For reference, watch South Park. Um, but it's a little bit different than the Jesus story, and by a little bit I mean a lot.
Right.
Um,
That's a hilarious example I like to use because it's the first
right.
one that comes to mind. But I think that if
Sure.
we do compare it to most religions in the world, we can find similar examples quite often. I don't see there particularly being anything special there.
You'd have to name a specific one for us to be able to compare whether the two line up or not, which is a whole other set of thing. But whether there's another thing that compares to this or not is one question. The other question is, or other issue is that even if you find something that looks like, well, we have some unexplained events over here, we still don't have an explanation for these events. And if it's just simply people believe strange things, believing strange things is one thing. But again, you're talking eyewitnesses who are willing to go to their death, people who were outside this thing and weren't involved from the beginning and had no stake in it, decided to hop on when it was already looking bad instead of, what most people do is they jump on the bandwagon when things are looking good. They hopped on when it was bad, and it continued to get worse and stayed. Which again, people do strange things for strange reasons, but it doesn't make a lot of sense. And then empty tomb, I don't think the grave robbing just to have a body and why you need that particular one when they could have just taken the other two guys from the cross would have probably been a little bit easier to get and nobody would have cared. Doesn't seem to really make much sense.
Yeah, I'd try to compare it to like Falun Gong would be the first thing on my list. Equally persecuted, equally more people who jumped on it when it was being persecuted by the Chinese government. I'd say that probably that one has corollary events and more in many cases.
Okay.
But cool. We've been going for about 2 hours. I think it's a good time to start wrapping up. Thanks for coming on. It was a really interesting conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. And by the way, your voice sounds exactly like Reed Nicewonder. Do you know who that is?
I don't.
Oh man, I would.
Is this good?
Yes. He is.
Okay,
he
good.
is known as having a very pleasant voice, and his demeanor is amazing. He's a street epistemologist. He runs Cordial Curiosity, I believe, is his YouTube channel. But yeah, your voice sounds exactly like his. It's amazing. I'd love to see you
cool.
guys. I'd love to see you on his channel. You two just talking to one another. It'd be hilarious.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks again for coming on. I really appreciate it, and I'll talk
Thanks
to you
for
later.
having me. Alrighty.